এভারগ্লেডসে ঐতিহাসিক সাফল্য দেখা গেছে।
ফক্স ৩৫ এর কার্লো বাইরন যেমন ব্যাখ্যা করেছেন, এটি রেকর্ড সংখ্যক বন্যপ্রাণী থেকে বার্মিজ পাইথন অপসারণে সহায়তা করছে।
যখন
When word got out, people couldn't stop laughing. Florida, a state already famous for strange headlines, was reportedly turning loose thousands of predators into its own backyard. Comedians joked about it. Strangers online called it the dumbest idea of the year. But nobody stopped to ask the one question that actually mattered. What if this crazy plan was the only thing standing between the Everglades and total collapse? Stick around, because the real story behind this decision is nothing like what the headlines made it sound like. To understand why Florida would ever consider something this bold, you have to go back to what the Everglades used to be. This wasn't just a swamp. It was one of the most productive wetland systems on the planet, a slow-moving river of grass stretching further than the eye could see. Deer grazed along the tree islands. Bobcats prowled the palmetto scrub at dawn. Raccoons picked through the shallows at night, and marsh rabbits darted through the underbrush so often that spotting one barely warranted a second glance. Economists have valued the services this ecosystem provides, from flood control to fisheries to tourism, at tens of billions of dollars a year. It wasn't just beautiful. It was functional, and function is exactly what was about to be lost. Nobody saw the danger coming because it didn't arrive with a roar. It arrived quietly, almost accidentally, in the early 1990s. A powerful hurricane tore through South Florida and, among the thousands of homes and buildings it destroyed, was a facility housing exotic reptiles. Cages broke open. Snakes escaped into the wetlands. Nobody was watching closely enough. Around the same time, the exotic pet trade was booming, and Burmese pythons, docile as hatchlings but enormous as adults, were being sold to owners who had no idea what they were getting into. When a 2-foot snake became a 15-foot snake, more than a few owners made the same mistake. They drove out to the edge of the swamp and let it go, assuming they were doing the humane thing. For a while, nothing seemed to happen. A python here, a python there. It looked like an oddity, not an emergency. But pythons are patient animals, and Florida's climate is nearly a perfect match for the jungles they came from. Warm, wet, and packed with prey, the Everglades gave them everything they needed to thrive undetected. And thrive they did. A single female python can lay somewhere close to 100 eggs in a season. Multiply that across years of undisturbed breeding in a landscape with no natural predators willing or able to challenge a snake that size, and the math becomes terrifying. Wildlife agencies now estimate that anywhere between 100,000 and possibly several hundred thousand Burmese pythons are living across South Florida. Nobody knows the real number because pythons are astonishingly good at not being seen. Their mottled skin blends perfectly into leaf litter and shadow, and they can lie motionless for hours, invisible even to trained researchers walking a few feet away. What makes this especially alarming is what happened to the animals that used to define the Everglades. Long-term surveys comparing wildlife counts before and after the python boom found declines that are hard to comprehend. Raccoon sightings dropped by well over 90% in python-heavy areas. Opossum numbers fell by a similar margin. Bobcat populations were cut by more than half in some survey zones, and white-tailed deer, once common enough to be unremarkable, became a rare find. Marsh rabbits all but disappeared from large stretches of the park. This wasn't a gradual, natural shift in wildlife numbers. It was a collapse, and it happened largely out of public view because most of it took place deep in wetlands that ordinary visitors never enter. The pythons themselves were not shy about their power. There are documented cases of Burmese pythons killing and consuming full-grown deer, and even video evidence of pythons locked in life-or-death struggles with alligators, sometimes winning. These are not small invasive pests nibbling at the edges of an ecosystem. These are apex predators capable of eating almost anything that moves, and for 2 decades they had no real check on their numbers. Florida did not sit still. Wildlife officials tried almost everything a modern conservation program could throw at the problem. Public hunts were organized, inviting anyone willing to wade into the swamp with a permit and a flashlight for a shot at prize money. These events drew hundreds of participants from across the country, and in recent years the winners have pulled in tens of thousands of dollars in prizes for the most and the largest snakes captured. It made for great television and even better headlines, but the actual numbers told a more sobering story. Even in record-breaking years, competitive hunts have accounted for only a few hundred snakes out of a population that may run into 6 figures. Recognizing that weekend hunters alone would never be enough, the state brought in professional contractors. Trained, paid python removal specialists now patrol the wetlands full-time, and since the program began, cumulative removals across all efforts have topped 20,000 snakes. It sounds impressive until you realize that even optimistic estimates put this at roughly 1%, maybe less, of the total population still out there. For every python captured, researchers believe dozens more hatch somewhere in the sawgrass, unseen and unaccounted for. Horror! Infected pythons shed the parasite's eggs in their waste. Cockroaches and other insects feed on that waste and pick up the eggs. Small lizards and frogs eat the insects. Native snakes, going about their normal hunting routines, eat those lizards and frogs, and without any external sign of danger, swallow the parasite along with their meal. Once inside a snake's body, the larvae migrate through the digestive tract and settle into the lungs, where they mature and multiply. 4 native snake species, many of which are far smaller and more delicate than an adult python, an infestation like this can be devastating. Affected snakes have been found suffering from lung damage, difficulty breathing, and severe weight loss. In some documented cases with worms visibly emerging from the state didn't stop at manpower. Engineers and biologists tried genuinely inventive tactics. Robotic decoys designed to mimic the heat and scent of live prey were deployed to lure pythons into detectable range. Detection dogs were trained to sniff out python scent trails through dense brush. Drones scanned marshland from above, and biologists fitted so-called scout snakes, male pythons implanted with radio transmitters, hoping the animal's own mating instincts would lead researchers straight to breeding females during nesting season. Some of these methods worked in isolated cases. None of them worked at the scale the crisis demanded. By the mid-2020s, many scientists working on the problem had arrived at an uncomfortable but honest conclusion. Total eradication of Burmese pythons from South Florida is not realistic. The population is too large, too well hidden, and too deeply established. The best outcome anyone could reasonably hope for was containment, slowing the spread, protecting key breeding areas for native species, and buying time. That admission, more than any single failed experiment, is what pushed Florida toward a different kind of solution altogether. The way it spreads is almost cinematic in Itzaml's mouth. Researchers have confirmed infections in well over a dozen native snake species, and the parasite's range has already expanded across a large stretch of the state, moving independently of the pythons that first carried it in. This matters because snakes are not simply background wildlife. They control rodent populations, they serve as prey for birds of prey and mammals, and they occupy a critical middle position in the food web. If native snake populations decline because of this parasite, the ripple effects extend far beyond the swamp. Curiously, one native species, the Florida cottonmouth, appears to resist infection far better than the others, a mystery scientists have not yet fully explained. It's a small silver lining in an otherwise grim discovery, and a reminder that the invasive species crisis in the Everglades was never just about one animal. It was against this backdrop of exhausted options that Florida wildlife officials announced something that, on paper, sounded almost self-defeating. They were going to release more snakes into the wild. Specifically, hundreds of eastern indigo snakes, a large, non-venomous native species, would be reintroduced across parts of the state as part of an effort to help restore ecological balance disrupted by the pythons. The public reaction was immediate and merciless. Social media lit up with jokes about a state that apparently thought more snakes was the answer to too many snakes. Commentators compared it to infamous ecological blunders of the past, invasive species introduced to control other invasive species that ended up making everything worse. Talk shows turned it into a punchline. Even some wildlife advocates admitted the optics were rough. After years of hunting pythons and warning residents about dangerous snakes in their backyards, here was the state releasing thousands of additional snakes into the same wild spaces. What almost none of the critics understood was that this program had almost nothing to do with the python crisis directly, and everything to do with a species that had quietly been circling extinction for decades, long before pythons ever slithered into Florida's swamps. The eastern indigo snake was once one of the most impressive predators in the American Southeast, and for good reason. It's the longest native snake in North America, capable of growing past 8 feet, with glossy blue-black scales that shimmer almost purple in direct sunlight and a soft blush of orange or coral coloring around its throat and chin. Unlike the venomous species people typically fear, the indigo relies on raw strength, speed, and fearlessness rather than toxins. It doesn't constrict its prey the way a python does either. It simply overpowers what it catches and swallows it alive. And its diet is remarkably broad. Indigo snakes eat rodents, birds, frogs, turtle eggs, and, notably, other snakes, including venomous ones like rattlesnakes and cottonmouths. They appear to have a natural resistance to pit viper venom, which lets them hunt animals most other predators would never dare approach. Wildlife researchers have documented individual indigo snakes with multiple prey species in their stomachs at once, evidence of just how efficient a hunter this animal is. At its historical peak, the eastern indigo ranged across a huge swath of the southeastern United States, from the coastal plains of Georgia and the Carolinas down through Florida and west into parts of Mississippi and Alabama. It thrived in longleaf pine forests, a habitat type that itself once covered tens of millions of acres across the South. That kingdom didn't survive contact with the 20th century. Logging and agricultural expansion wiped out the vast majority of longleaf pine forest, leaving the indigo with only scattered fragments of its former range. The pet trade took a toll too, as collectors targeted the species for its striking appearance. Perhaps most devastating of all was its close relationship with the gopher tortoise. Indigo snakes depend heavily on the deep burrows tortoises dig, using them as shelter from cold snaps, safe places to lay eggs, and refuge from predators. During the Great Depression, hunters seeking tortoise meat dug up burrows across the region, and rattlesnake hunters historically pumped gas into burrows to flush out venomous snakes for roundups, killing indigos hiding inside as collateral damage. As tortoise populations crashed, so did the indigo's access to safe habitat. By the late 20th century, the decline was severe enough that the U.S. government listed the eastern indigo snake as a threatened species. Breeding populations had shrunk to a handful of isolated pockets, mostly in Florida, with scattered remnants in Georgia. A snake that once ruled an ecosystem spanning nearly 90 million acres had been reduced to fragments so small that some biologists feared it might vanish from parts of its native range entirely. What the public didn't know when the release announcement made headlines was that conservation teams had already spent years, in some cases decades, laying the groundwork for exactly this moment. Captive breeding programs had been carefully maintaining genetically diverse indigo snake populations. Habitat restoration crews had been clearing invasive plants, reintroducing controlled burns to mimic the natural fire cycles longleaf pine forests depend on, and rebuilding gopher tortoise populations so their burrows would be available again for returning indigos. This wasn't an impulsive reaction to the python crisis. It was a patient, methodical restoration effort that happened to become newsworthy at the same moment Florida's snake problem was dominating headlines, creating an unfortunate coincidence that made the whole program look reckless when it was anything but. And then, slowly, signs began to emerge that something in the Everglades was changing. Researchers tracking a large male python fitted with a GPS collar as part of a breeding study got a signal that stopped moving. When they went to investigate, they found the animal dead, its head removed, hidden beneath pine debris. A trail camera later revealed the culprit. A bobcat weighing a fraction of the python's size had killed and eaten an adult of a species that, for 2 decades, had faced essentially no natural predators in Florida. It wasn't an isolated event. Wildlife cameras and field researchers began documenting alligators preying on smaller pythons. Reports surfaced of eastern indigo snakes consuming juvenile Burmese pythons in the wild, exactly the behavior conservationists had hoped to see. Even the endangered Florida panther has reportedly been documented taking on pythons. None of this suggested the crisis was over. A handful of predation events cannot undo 2 decades of ecological damage or offset the reproductive output of tens of thousands of breeding pythons. But it did suggest something conservationists badly needed, proof that native wildlife hadn't simply given up, and that the ecosystem retained some capacity to adapt and fight back. The most significant moment, though, didn't involve a python at all. In the autumn of 2023, biologists monitoring a restoration site in North Florida's longleaf pine country found something they had been waiting years for: 2 wild-hatched eastern indigo snake hatchlings, born to parents that had themselves been part of earlier reintroduction releases. Crucially, at least one of the hatchlings had never been tagged or handled, meaning it had been born entirely in the wild, without direct human assistance. For a species that hadn't reproduced naturally in that part of Florida in roughly 50 years, this was enormous. It meant the reintroduced population wasn't just surviving on human support. It was becoming self-sustaining. In the following 2 years, more confirmed sightings followed. A healthy adult male was recorded moving through restored habitat. Nearly 20 snakes released years earlier were re-identified in the wild, evidence that they had survived and established territories. A female from an even earlier release cohort was found still alive and active years later. Similar reintroduction efforts across the state line in Alabama have also shown promise, with dozens more snakes released there and hundreds returned to their historic range across the broader region in recent years. None of this means Florida's python problem is solved. It isn't, and experts are honest about that. The eastern indigo snake cannot single-handedly undo an invasion measured in the tens or hundreds of thousands. What it can do, alongside hunters, contractors, and every other tool in the state's arsenal, is nudge the balance back in a healthier direction, one restored predator, one rebuilt habitat, one wild-born hatchling at a time. The irony of this whole saga is hard to ignore. People mock the release of a native harmless predator while cheering on hunters chasing an invasive one, without realizing both efforts were aimed at the exact same goal, restoring a system that had been knocked badly out of balance. One approach focused on removal. The other focused on rebuilding. Real ecological recovery, it turns out, rarely comes from a single dramatic fix. It comes from patiently reassembling the pieces of a system until it can start supporting itself again. So the next time you see a headline that sounds too strange to be real, it might be worth pausing before you laugh. Sometimes the wildest-sounding decisions are the product of years of careful science, not a moment of panic. And sometimes, against every expectation, they actually work. What do you think? Can Florida's native predators eventually hold their own against an invasion this size? Let us know in the comments, and if you want more stories like this one, stick around for what's coming next.